So thank you very much, and I think my paper is going to intersect in great ways with Tori's. We all know, I think, here that we are at a moment of immense transformation in terms of university systems that really presents a grave challenge to social justice. It's a moment of massive change that has also unleashed resistance in certain cases. And we've seen movements in India, in Mexico, in South Africa, in Chile, and in Canada, which is what I'm going to focus on today is a Canadian example, which is a student strike in Quebec in 2012 that shut down much of the post-secondary system for over 6 months and defeated a 75% tuition increase. And I think the question that I'm going to try to focus on for the session today will be, what will it take to defeat the current restructuring that we're facing and to center a post-secondary system on social justice. There are 4 key dimensions to this process of restructuring. Oops, I forgot to start my timer. That I'm just going to briefly talk about. I think we all know them, but I'm just trying to sketch a general picture. First of all, privatization, the use of private sector mechanisms to undercut any idea of education as a social right that includes everything from user pay, the dramatic increase in tuitions, through to competition within and between institutions to a top-down managerial model. Secondly, the intensification of labor, of the labor of learning and teaching, is a typical feature of this, whether that's class size increases, online education, or the productivity pressure that's there through performance measurement and publication pressure. Thirdly is what you could loosely call application. That's the language that they sometimes use, the reorientation, a disdain for the liberal arts and sciences, and a focus on what's called application, but in fact is an orientation towards the perceived needs of business and the state, a pressure towards a more occupational education, though intriguingly in many cases, liberal arts and sciences are being reserved in elite educational institutions. An emphasis on commercialization and commodification in all kinds of ways, and an emphasis certainly in Canadian universities at this point on creating a culture of what they call entrepreneurship and innovation. And interestingly, in the Canadian case, that's drawing specifically, in cases that I could talk about, but I don't have the time today, on Israel as a model, and Israeli post-secondary as a model, exactly at the time that the BDS movement is growing in Canada. And lastly, we're seeing an increase in differentiation, the idea that the elite have their own hermetically sealed system of education separate from the rest, which in Canada actually hasn't existed to the extent that it has in certain other places, where the whole system in Canada is public and is relatively level compared to many other places for historic reasons that I'm obviously not going to go into. They claim that they're doing this because universities cost too much, they can't afford it, and because universities are backwards, they haven't kept up with the changing world. We're using 15th century methods in the era of the 21st century, so on. But the reality is they want to restructure the university to prepare students for a neoliberal world, which has 2 key dimensions in terms of work, increased precariousness, increased equality along lines that are racialized, gendered, have to do with migration status and indigeneity, and a world, in short, without a net, or at least where the internet has replaced the social safety net. And also a thinner conception of citizenship, because part of neoliberalism is about the idea that economics trumps politics, and the goal of politics is simply about creating the world that the economy needs. And I want to argue, using the Quebec example, that if we all know basically what I've sketched out, if we want to stop this, we shouldn't do that, and we can't do that by simply defending what is. by simply defending systems, organizations, a system of post-secondary that was designed for elite formation, now includes broader layers of the population, but has not been transformed to meet the needs of the broader layers of the population who've been brought in, still uses the methods of elite formation. That is built around a Eurocentric and colonial frame that I'm going to talk briefly about below, that is built around the fragmentation of knowledge through a kaleidoscope of disciplines that impede clearer vision, through traditions of writing for nobody, that is the core of academic writing, and an ethos of disinterest, of being above the fray and separate from the struggle, that leads to an idea of scholarship that's separate from the real needs of society. We can't mobilize a movement around defending a broken system or a wrong system. It's not broken, that's exactly what it's meant to do. And therefore we need to develop our own transformative vision as part of the struggle to resist. And I want to argue that transformative vision needs to have 4 dimensions that unfortunately I'm going to go over quite briefly, because then I want to talk about the how-tos of the struggle. First of all, we need to make access and inclusion at the core. There are 4 key elements to it. Number 1, access and inclusion. That means not only eliminating the barriers that remain in terms of class, race, indigeneity, and so on, but a transformative inclusion. So that people who are brought into the institution, people are welcomed and in fact make it their own. Secondly, decolonization, both in the immediate term, which is particularly important in Canada as a settler colonial state, that means centering on Indigenous rights in very specific ways, and there's various documents from Indigenous communities calling for that quite specifically. But also in a broader sense, the term decolonization is also used more generally to talk about the way that the core of both the disciplines in our universities and hardwired into the character of the institutions is a heterosexual, white, elite, male perspective, and that unless we challenge that through a decolonizing process, we end up, again, defending the indefensible. Thirdly, through democracy, in the classroom, in the institutional governance, in our resistance movements. That is the best way to undercut the commercial model, because one of the resonances of the commercial model among students is that being customers seems more powerful than being a student. We need to say, but being democratic participants has been much more powerful than being customers. And in fact, student power and worker power is the core to a better system of post-secondary education. And finally, we need to keep in mind that this needs to be built around a demand for good conditions of work for all on campus, and that's important not only for workers who increasingly are facing precariousness and bad conditions, and for students who are increasingly facing poverty and overwork. It's not only important in itself, but it's also important because it's important to be fighting around the future of work at the institutions where many frame their expectations of future work. So that's a sketch, and it sounds awfully bold at a time when we often feel when we're on the defensive against administrative and government onslaughts that are changing every aspect of our way of work to upping the scale in our demands rather than getting into a defensive mode. But I want to argue this is exactly the time to be doing it. I think there's all kinds of evidence that everyone in this room knows much more than me about that young people are angry in different ways, whether that's expressed through the Bernie Sanders phenomenon in the States or the Corbyn phenomenon in Britain, whether it's expressed through a freshman survey of American students has been running every year, first-year American university students for the last 50 years, that argues that right now students have an openness to protest, according to this survey, that's higher than any time since the 1960s and 1970s. We've seen it in when that anger connects with what seems like possibilities, we suddenly see young people rallying in incredibly large numbers, whether that's in Black Lives Matter, Occupy, the movements of the squares in Greece or Spain, or in the amazing uprisings across North Africa and West Asia that involve disproportionate numbers of young people. There's a receptivity to counter ideas among younger people, but often a lack of a sense of counter power that makes the counter ideas possible. And so what I want to argue to kind of tie this together is we need not only to develop the bold vision, but to talk about the means to deliver it. And that's where the term infrastructure of dissent, which I've used as a title here, I'm saying we need to think about how it is that people build up the resistance capacities required to build counterpower. And there are four, I don't know why I keep having these lists of four, there are four key aspects to that counterpower. The ability for analysis collectively to think against the dominant together in different ways. There's a need for communications, not dependent on official channels. A need for memory to challenge the invented traditions and the official story of how things got to be this way. And a need for effective solidarities that means not only finding ways to work together, but to build solidarities based on the needs of the most vulnerable and the most oppressed. And that this infrastructure of dissent, which is the way people develop these various mechanisms, which varies from situation to situation, must be sustained and reproduced over political generations. Neoliberalism has been incredibly corrosive to the infrastructure of dissent by political design in part. Unions have been seriously affected. Plant closures, gentrification, and the destruction of public housing and public space undercuts neighborhood and community. The commercialization of space on campuses undercuts collectivity on campuses. Yet there remains a potential for collectivity that's high on campuses. Within the classroom, within the halls, and so on, there are spaces where potential collectivity is high, and this brings me lastly to the question that we learned through the Quebec student strike of organizing. One of the core ideas in the Quebec student strike was that students need to be organized as workers. And this comes out, they adopted it out of a declaration from the French UNEF, the Charte de Grenoble from 1946, both because of the eventual workplace location of students, because of the labor process of studenthood, and because of the power of collectivity and withdrawal of labor, that student strikes are actually an incredibly powerful part of a transformative campus agenda. And in the Quebec student movement, they've developed a number of mechanisms to make the strike possible. And in the minute and a half remaining, I can't go through the number. I will say at the core of it, though, there have been 9 general strikes in the Quebec student movement since 1968. And at the core of the strike is the General Assembly, the democratic meeting where the strike vote is taken through discussion, and with all kinds of mechanisms to make sure that that strike vote is actually representative of something. If you have a tiny General Assembly that votes for a strike, it works out to be a disaster because it doesn't actually represent anything. So there are all kinds of ways that student power expressed this way, and this kind of student unionism based on the withdrawal of labor also then provides crucial ways for building student coalitions with other workers on campus, and a transformative agenda based essentially on workers' power and workers' control that challenges the dominant agenda. So in my last words, neoliberalism is beatable by building a kind of infrastructure of dissent through student worker coalitions around the needs of the most vulnerable, but only if we have a broad transformative vision of democratizing, decolonizing, working towards access, and towards better jobs as part of a better future. Thank you.